than in many parts of the world. Okay? But the interesting point is to note the import-exports line, the production line. That big dip there, that's Piper Alpha. That's when we had the major disaster when we lost a platform. And tragically, many men died as a consequence of that. And the oil fields were not pumping to the extent they had been previously. But it recovered again. And you can see, as Phil mentioned, around 2000, that's when we hit peak. That's when UK oil production went into decline. Never recovered since. And since about 2005, we've year on year moved between some months a net importer of oil, some months a net exporter of oil. We are now simply a net importer of oil. We have to buy a lot more of our oil in than we were doing previously. Okay? And that will get worse and worse and worse. Interestingly enough, when we were selling it, oil was at the lowest price it has been historically. Now we have to buy it. That price is much, much higher. Around $80 a barrel we're looking at the moment, but we may see spikes much higher than that. Always the way, isn't it? When we're selling gold, we sell it at the lowest possible price ever, and then when we have to start buying the bloody stuff back, it's at an incredible high rate. The same with oil as well. Okay? Now there's a black line there around about 1976. That's an important line to understand. 1976 is the IMF crisis. This is when our Prime Minister of the time went to the IMF, cap in hand, asking for loans, because essentially Britain was bankrupt. Austerity measures were being talked about, huge cuts in public services, etc., etc., etc. The Wall Street Journal had as a headline, "Goodbye Great Britain." That's the way it was seen. Britain was gone as an economic power. And yet, a couple of decades later, by the mid-90s, we were the fourth richest nation in the world. Many reasons for this, but one of the critical ones is oil. We were the Saudi of Europe. We were a major oil producer. We had major inputs from the sales of oil. Not from the sale of oil directly, through taxes, through the sale of licenses for the production of oil, for many other indirect reasons. But it had an enormous impact on our economy. It's interesting to note when the IMF crisis hit is when we weren't producing oil. What will it be like as we go into decline, as we have to buy more and more oil? I'm not here to predict exactly what will happen in that state, but I think anybody looking at these kinds of graphs, understanding these kinds of figures, will realise this is not healthy for our balance of payments, any way, shape or form. Oil has been an important buffer, an important economic buffer for the UK that we are now losing, and losing very rapidly. Just to move on to the current crisis. I'm afraid Phil sounds much funnier than me. I tend to have this kind of silence drifts over the crowd as they begin to hear what I'm saying. I don't mean to upset people or get it depressing, but it's important we face what the realities are. These are two graphs. The top one is inflation for the Eurozone. The bottom one is the price of oil, and it's from about 2002 through to 2009. And as the price of oil first began to go up, because we had pressuring growth from China. Remember, China is a population of 1.5 billion people, okay, with a growth rate of 10%. Every 7 years, their economy is twice the size it was for the entirety of its history before. So every 7 years, it's using twice as many resources than it's used for the whole of its previous history. These are phenomenal rates of growth. Population 1.5 billion. When we last saw rates of growth like that was the Industrial Revolution, when there was just a few million of us living in this country. 1.5 billion people consuming at that rate puts huge pressure on the resources of this planet. Their middle class is about the same size as the population of Europe and America together. So as their middle class begin to consume more and more, they're going to want similar lifestyles to us. They're going to need to consume resources at a similar level to us. And oil is one of those very critical resources, as I've tried to point out. And so we begin to see more and more pressure on the price of oil, and the price begin to move up and up and up. But interestingly, there's no correlation to inflation. There's no pressure on goods going up, the cost of goods, the consumer going up. And it led many economists to say, oh, oil's disconnected from the economy anymore. We don't need to worry about it. It has no impact whatsoever. I giggled a bit at that point because what do? Well, I work with organisations. I work with companies as businesses. And I knew what was going on. I knew that companies on the whole were absorbing these increased costs. They were playing a form of economic chicken, competitive chicken. If they put their costs up, they knew their competitors would grab market share and then just put their costs up anyway. And so they didn't want to be the ones who put their costs up first. So they'd just absorb them into their margins. What we were seeing was bubbles of inflation under the economic indicators. Stuff we weren't seeing that was going on, but was working its way up slowly through the economy to the consumer. And by mid-2006, end of 2006, that bubble made its way through to the economy and burst through to the surface. And we can see then a very big correlation between inflation and oil price. What we're seeing in this period is an interesting interaction between monetary policy, certain financial products, and speculation. As inflation begins to creep up, what do central banks do to control the monetary supply? They begin to push interest rates up. Okay? This has a number of impacts on individuals. One, inflation means your basic cost of living is going up. Petrol was going up, we can all remember that, it still happens. It's funny, isn't it, how as the price of oil goes up, the price of petrol goes up, and then as the price of oil goes down, the price of petrol stays the same. It doesn't seem to go the opposite direction, unfortunately. So transportation, getting to work was costing us more. Heating our homes was costing us more. Food increases, food price increases, food was costing us more. And as interest rates were being put up, so was all that debt many of us had been amassing, was beginning to cost us more and more. We were being hit in our pockets from 4 different directions: food, transport, heating, and our loads, our debts, hitting us more and more. And as the inflation increased, monetary policy again dictates to keep putting up interest rates, putting a squeeze on those subprime mortgages, those weak loans that were put out there, those bad loans that were put out there. But this begins to interact with another financial product, not just our loans, but with something called fixed-term products. These are like bonds and gilts, government debt in many ways, and they have a fixed interest rate. So as the interest rate goes up, actually they begin to be worth less to speculators. So what do speculators do? Well, they'll dump them, and they'll look for somewhere else to put their money to make those short-term profits that they're hunting for. And where is the price going up? Where is there a possibility of them making substantial gains? Well, commodities. It's not just oil doing this, wheat, steel. Many of the resources, many of the commodities required for development are showing similar price patterns. And so speculators start to throw money after money after money into these particular commodities. And this is when we get this very rapid price spike occurring. Okay? And a subsequent spike in inflation, a very rapid increase in inflation. So people who are under pressure already suddenly find their petrol prices going up still, their heating costs, the food costs, their loan costs. Well, they've only got so much money, and remember, many of these subprime mortgages, they could only just repay their loan, service their loan, when interest rates were at a low rate. Once these interest rates began to creep up, along with many other inflationary pressures, they had to make serious choices. Do I pay to get to work? Do I pay to eat? Do I pay to heat my house? Or do I reservice the loan? The loan is the one that they dropped. And this is when we get the credit crisis hit.